Before they've started, in order to inspire the men, Confederate officers point to the Union Ridge and tell the men that home is just over there, just over that ridge. They can breach the Union line, the war can be won, and everybody can go home. Home is just over that ridge. The fact that the Confederate target a copse of trees in the center of the Union lines began to cause the Confederates to begin to move toward the center. Union artillery fire on the Confederate right and left has forced the men to the center away from the fire. As gaps are created by exploding shells in the Confederate lines, the men move forward and dress the lines. Very difficult maneuver, especially under fire. It means that they close the gaps by moving shoulder to shoulder. This continues to narrow the width of the Confederate attack line as they approach the Union troops on Cemetery Ridge. Now, as the Confederates approach the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, they're not really taking direct fire in their front. Because during the bombardment, the overall Union artillery officer, Henry Hunt, expecting the appearance of Confederate infantry, has ordered his men to halt their fire and save their ammunition for the appearance of the Confederates. But General Hancock, in the center of the Union line, wants to keep the morale of his troops as high as he can. And his guns have continued to fire long-range ammunition. So when the Confederates appear, they're actually only taking cannon fire on their right and left. That's what begins to force these Confederates toward the center.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a courtesy, you can feel the breeze picking up and look over to the west a bit. We just want you to be aware that there is a storm watch posted. This is a courtesy. We'd just like you to be aware there's a storm watch in effect.
In the immediate target area of the Union line, there are approximately 6,000 men of the Union 6th Corps. The Union 2nd Corps under General Winfield Scott Hancock of Norristown, Pennsylvania. The main part of the Confederate advance consists of about 12,500 men, later supported by another brigade of 2,500 men on the far right, for a total of 15,000 men on the Confederate side making this attack over fields almost a mile wide. The distance of the march is approximately 7/8 of a mile between the two ridges. It will take the Confederates about 20 minutes to cover that ground. When the Confederates reach the Emmitsburg Road, they get some shelter from the sunken road and the two 5.5-foot tall wooden fences in front of them. In order to inspire his men, one of General Pickets' brigade commanders, Lewis Armistead, will place his hat on the tip of his sword and say, "Who will follow me?" It will be about 200 of his Virginians that will not only reach the wall defended by the Union soldiers, but will actually breach it temporarily. Lewis Armistead's uncle was George Armistead, who was the commander of the U.S. forces at Fort McHenry in the War of 1812. When Francis Scott Key wrote of the flag still flying after the British had bombarded Fort McHenry, it was George Armistead, Lewis Armistead's uncle, that was commanding those U.S. forces where that flag still flew. And now, 51 years later, George Armistead's nephew is leading the Confederates against those very same stars and stripes. Because the width of the Confederate line has been narrowed as they advance, it allows Union forces on the right and left, on the right men from Ohio and New York, and on the left men from Vermont, to swing down and engulf the ends of the Confederate lines.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're leaning on the rail or you're up next to the rail, that means the people behind you can't get out, nor can they take pictures either. Would you be kind enough and be courteous enough to your fellow man to step away from the rail and sit back in the grandstands, please? Thank you.
As the Confederates advance toward the wall held by the Union forces, they are entering a gauntlet of three-sided small arms fire. On their right from Vermonters, in front of them from Philadelphia troops at the wall, and on their left from New York and Ohio troops. But in addition to that, Union cannons pour canister, which is basically like a shotgun being fired out of a cannon directly into Confederate space. And despite all this, Confederates not only reached the wall, they breached it and forced the Union troops back up onto the crest of Cemetery Ridge, where they would reform and be reinforced. And they would counterattack and converge upon the Confederates who had broken through the Union lines temporarily. The Confederates realized they need support to exploit their temporary breakthrough. They look back in the distance to the tree line they've come from. Basically see what you see today. Except for the dead and the wounded, the fields are empty. No one is coming. Now they begin to realize that Pickets' charge may be doomed to failure. Confederate General Longstreet, looking from the distant ridge through his binoculars, has determined that the attack has failed, and he does not wish to send more good troops after a bad result. Confederates approach a Union wall, a Union-defended wall, the Union soldiers reach out over the wall, and through all this noise and confusion and smoke, the Union soldiers beckon to the Confederates on the other side of the wall. Come on over. Come on over to this side of the Lord. Come on over as prisoners. We don't want to have to kill men so brave as to make this 20-minute charge, only to be killed in front of the wall. And many of them did cross, but only as prisoners. Only half the Confederates that make this charge will return to Seminary Ridge, and many of them will be carrying Yankee lead with them when they return, which of course means they're wounded. And that means that over 50% of the men who make this attack will become casualties of one form or another, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. As the survivors stream back to Seminary Ridge, General Lee, their commander, comes out to greet them. And he tells them, all of this has been my fault. I thought my men were invincible. You must do all you can to help me out of this. He asks his men to reform on Seminary Ridge against a possible Union counterattack that will not come. With the conclusion of Pickets' charge, the Battle of Gettysburg would come to a close, but the war itself would continue for nearly 2 more years. Union soldiers, jubilant, have avenged their loss 6 months before at Fredericksburg, Virginia, where they had attacked against Confederates behind a stone wall, only to be shot down. Upon realizing their victory, they began to chant, "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg."
Here comes the rain.